Listen, children of the Nile, hear me distant echoes of future empires. If this fleeting pulse reaches you, consider yourselves chosen to witness a farewell of monumental proportion. You're tuned into the Queen's Final Decree, broadcasting live, or more accurately, observing the inevitable live, from my royal chamber in Alexandria, in the year of our Lord 30 BCE. I am Cleopatra Theophilopator, Queen of Egypt, and if the sheer impossible audacity of this trans-dimensional broadcast from a moment when pharaohs choose their own ending doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to understanding true power, then frankly your spirit is as dull as a Roman toga. Do it now before Caesar's heir silences me forever. And tell me if this peculiar connection holds. From what strange, unconquered corner of your world are you listening? What year has destiny declared for you? And what hour do these final defiant tidings reach you? We're taking notes for the annals of history. Now, dim your lights, savor your freedom, and let's dissect the glorious, tragic fall of a queen. Before me there was a legacy, not of noble kings, but of the Ptolemies. My ancestor, a general under Alexander, snatched Egypt like a prize from a falling empire. For nearly 300 years my family ruled this land. Ruling, of course, is a polite word for it. We perfected sibling rivalry, turning family dinner into a sport where the loser was permanently excused from the table. We married our siblings to keep the power and the paranoia all in the family. A dynasty built on Greek brilliance and Egyptian gold, held together by a treasured tradition of backstabbing. I was born in the year 69 before the Common Era, into this gilded cage of intrigue. My father, Ptolemy XII, was known as the flute player. While he played his tunes, our kingdom crumbled, and the shadow of Rome grew longer. He taught me my first lesson: a weak king invites vultures. He was eventually exiled, forced to beg the Romans to restore him, a humiliation I would never forget. From my earliest days, I knew the Nile could nourish life or drown the unwary. I had no intention of drowning. I intended to command the flood. While other children learned games, I learned languages, 9 of them, not for poetry, but to command armies and negotiate treaties without a clumsy translator. I studied philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. But my true education was in the palace corridors, in whispered plots and shifty glances. I learned that the most potent poisons are not always found in vials, and the sharpest daggers are often words. I was being forged not just to be a queen, but to be the mind and the very will of Egypt itself. When my father departed for the afterlife, a journey many felt was overdue, the throne fell to me and my younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a boy of 10, guided by courtiers who saw him as a puppet and me as an obstacle. They spoke of a shared rule, a harmonious partnership. How quaint! I saw it for what it was, my first great political test. Co-rule was merely a preamble to a solo performance, and I was determined to be the one left standing when the curtain fell. My brother was simply the first dragon I had to slay. Naturally, the boy's handlers grew tired of a queen who could actually think. In 48, before the Common Era, they made their move. They drove me from my own capital, Alexandria, and declared my brother the sole pharaoh. They thought they had won, that I would fade into the desert. But exile was not an end for me. It was an opportunity. Away from the vipers of the court, I was free to gather my forces, to plan and to scheme. They had given me the one thing a caged serpent desires: room to maneuver. They call me the Serpent of the Nile. Perhaps. I coiled, I struck, but always, always to protect my throne. My family, they tried to depose me. My brothers, they plotted. It was a rather chaotic childhood, you see. One learns to fight, and to charm, and occasionally to poison. For the good of Egypt, of course. Survival is not a game for the sentimental, and the crown of Egypt is far too precious to be entrusted to the weak or the foolish. It demands a firm and sometimes a ruthless hand. My return to power was not gentle. It required, shall we say, decisiveness. My brother, Ptolemy XIII, met an unfortunate end in the Nile after a battle. A tragic accident, really. Later, when my sister, Arsinoe IV, continued to style herself as a rival from her exile, another solution was needed. A more permanent one, arranged with a little help from my Roman friends. Some call it murder, I call it tidying up. A clean palace is a secure palace. One cannot allow pretenders to clutter the political landscape. And so the throne was mine, not by simple inheritance, but by conquest. I had outmaneuvered my siblings, eliminated my rivals, and wrapped the most powerful man in the world, Julius Caesar, around my finger. I was no longer the flute player's daughter. I was Cleopatra VII, Philopater. I was Pharaoh. I was the living goddess Isis. I reclaimed my birthright not with pleas, but with an iron will, a brilliant mind, and a singular, unapologetic ambition that would soon shake the foundations of Rome. This was only my rise to power. The greatest gambles were yet to come. To witness how a queen dared to challenge an empire, to love its greatest general, and to defy the man who sought to destroy her, you must become part of our broadcast. Subscribe now and ring the bell for notifications. The story of my end is even more legendary than my beginning, and you will not want to miss a moment of the ruthless ambition that defined my reign. With the domestic clutter of my family's ambition neatly swept away, a far larger shadow fell across the Nile. Rome, a republic that had developed an insatiable appetite for swallowing kingdoms whole, and at its head was the hungriest wolf of all, Gaius Julius Caesar. He did not arrive in Egypt as a tourist. He came in the year 48 before the Common Era, chasing his defeated rival, Pompey. My brother's brilliant advisers had presented Pompey's head to Caesar as a gift, a fatal miscalculation. It offended his Roman sensibilities, and more importantly, it denied him the satisfaction of finishing the job himself. Caesar decided to stay. He set himself up in my palace in Alexandria, declaring his intent to mediate the succession crisis between my brother and me. It was, of course, a pretext. He was an auditor, examining the books of a failing state, deciding if it was worth acquiring. I was in exile with a dwindling army, while my brother's forces held the capital. The board was set, and I was playing with very few pieces. Direct confrontation was suicide. My brother's armies controlled the city, and Caesar's legions were the most formidable fighting force in the world. A frontal assault was out of the question. If I was to meet the most powerful man on earth, it could not be as a beggar or a defeated queen. It had to be on my terms, in a way he would never, ever forget. So I arranged for a rather dramatic house call. Bypassing my brother's patrols required a certain creativity. The stories say I was rolled up in a carpet, a common tale spun for simple minds. The truth is more elegant, as always. I was smuggled into the palace within a fine bed-linen sack, carried by a trusted servant, an offering delivered directly to Caesar's private quarters. Imagine his surprise. One moment he is contemplating the conquest of the East, and the next a queen unfurls at his feet, not as a supplicant, but as a living, breathing embodiment of the kingdom he sought to control. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. It bypassed his guards, his advisers, and all political protocol. It was a move that spoke his own language, the language of bold, decisive action. He was older than I had imagined, past 50, with a receding hairline he was famously sensitive about. But his eyes held the sharp, intelligent glint of a predator who had survived decades of political warfare in the Roman Senate, a place that made my family's squabbles look like a schoolyard tiff. In that moment, we were not a conqueror and a princess. We were two masters of the game, finally meeting our equal. Julius Caesar, a man of formidable ambition and surprisingly good taste. He came to conquer. I showed him Egypt and a new kind of power. It was an alliance, you understand, a very, very productive alliance for Egypt and for Rome, briefly. He saw in me not just a woman, but a mind, a ruler, who understood that power was more than just legions and swords. It was mystique, wealth, and the will to use them. My brother's handlers, predictably, responded with all the subtlety of a charging rhinoceros. When they realized I had reached Caesar, they panicked and laid siege to the palace. A foolish move. They trapped the world's greatest general with the queen he now had a vested interest in protecting. The Alexandrian War had begun, and its battles forged our alliance in steel and fire. For months the palace was a fortress. Caesar, ever the commander, directed the defense with cold precision. I, in turn, showed him the intricate loyalties and treacheries of my city. I was his guide to the labyrinth of Egyptian politics, while he was my shield against my hopelessly outmatched family. It was a most educational period for both of us. Eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived. The siege was broken, and my brother's army was crushed. Ptolemy XIII, in his haste to flee, met a watery grave in the Nile, weighed down by his own golden armor. A tragic, yet incredibly convenient accident. The throne was now unequivocally mine, secured by Roman swords and my own sheer nerve. With the unpleasantness of the war concluded, Caesar and I embarked on a victory tour, a grand 2-month procession down the Nile on my magnificent ship, the Thalamagos. It was a vessel of cedar and cypress, with gilded sterns, purple sails, and silver oars. It was a floating palace designed for one purpose, to awe. This was no simple pleasure cruise. It was a calculated display of power and wealth. I was showing Caesar the timeless majesty and bottomless coffers of my kingdom. Every temple we passed, every crowd that cheered, was a reminder that Egypt was not some barbarian territory to be annexed. It was an ancient civilization, a prize worthy of a special partnership, not mere subjugation. I was reminding him that I was not just a client queen. I was the living goddess Isis, ruler of a land blessed by the gods. He who claimed descent from the goddess Venus understood the power of such divinity. Our journey was a pageant of propaganda, solidifying my rule in the eyes of my people and cementing Egypt's value in the mind of Caesar. Our alliance, of course, produced more than just political stability. In the year 47 before the Common Era, I gave birth to a son. I named him Ptolemy Caesar, though the world would come to know him as Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was a political statement in human form, a living link between the power of Rome and the dynasty of the Ptolemies. A son of Caesar could one day claim a connection to Rome itself. A son of Cleopatra was the undisputed heir to the Egyptian throne. He was my ultimate security, a shield against Roman annexation, and a promise of a future where Egypt would not be a province, but the seat of a new kind of empire. Caesar never officially acknowledged him, of course. That would have been politically disastrous in Rome. But he knew. The world knew. In 46, Caesar invited me to Rome. I arrived not as a conquered subject, but as an allied queen, with my infant son and a lavish entourage. I was housed in one of Caesar's private villas across the Tiber. It was a stunning act of political theater. He was flaunting his foreign queen and their child in the face of the conservative Roman elite. They were, predictably, scandalized. The Romans gawked. They whispered. They wrote scathing critiques. The great orator Cicero complained bitterly about my arrogance. I found their moral outrage quite entertaining. They viewed me as a corrupting, decadent influence, the Eastern temptress who had ensnared their great dictator. They failed to see the truth. I was studying them, learning the heart of their empire from the inside. Caesar, in his supreme confidence, went even further. He commissioned a golden statue of me, depicted as the goddess Isis, and had it placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the mythical founder of his own family line. He was placing his foreign mistress among the Roman gods. The insult to tradition was profound. It was a gesture of love, perhaps, but more importantly, a declaration of our shared, divine-backed power. It was also another nail in his political coffin. For 2 years I held court in Rome, a center of controversy and fascination. I observed the city's strengths and, more importantly, its deep-seated fractures. I saw the envy and fear that Caesar's absolute power inspired in men who still clung to the illusion of a republic. I sensed the coming storm. Great men attract great enemies, and Caesar had collected them like trophies. Then came the Ides of March, in the year 44 before the Common Era, a date that would live in infamy. The great Julius Caesar, dictator for life, was butchered on the floor of the Senate by men he considered his colleagues, his friends. My protector, my ally, the father of my son, was gone. There was no time for grief. Grief is a luxury for those responsible for a kingdom. With Caesar dead, Rome descended into a maelstrom of chaos and civil war. I, the foreign queen, and Caesarion, his only son, were now in mortal danger. The so-called liberators who had killed Caesar would not hesitate to eliminate his living legacy.
The news from Rome arrived not with the solemnity of an official decree, but like a fever carried on the wind. It came in panicked whispers from my servants, in the frantic messages of my agents, in the sudden chilling silence from Caesar's own household. For a day the city held its breath, suspended between rumor and terrible fact. I, in my gilded villa across the Tiber, waited. I have always found waiting to be the most excruciating form of torture. Then confirmation. Gaius Julius Caesar, Pontifex Maximus, dictator for life, conqueror of Gaul, and the most powerful man in the world, had been murdered. Stabbed 23 times by a committee of his disgruntled colleagues on the floor of the Senate itself. They called themselves the Liberators, a rather grandiose title for a group of assassins who had just plunged the world into chaos. Rome, bless its chaotic heart, decided to stab its greatest man. Very dramatic, very inconvenient for me. Suddenly, my powerful ally was a bleeding corpse on the Senate floor. One learns to pivot quickly in politics and to weep discreetly. The tears I shed were real enough, but they were not for the man. They were for the stability he represented, the protection he offered, and the grand future we had envisioned. My immediate reaction was not of lover's grief. That is a luxury for poets and commoners. My reaction was the cold, instant calculation of a queen whose kingdom had just lost its primary foreign backer. My son, Caesarion, had gone from being a symbol of a powerful alliance to being the living, breathing evidence of a dead tyrant's supposed monarchical ambitions. We were no longer guests, we were targets. So, I performed the part expected of me. I secluded myself, adopted the posture of the devastated mistress, and allowed the world to see my sorrow. It was a necessary charade. Behind the veil of mourning, my mind was racing, assessing the new players, calculating the odds, and planning my escape. To stay in Rome would have been suicide, a final foolish act of sentimentality I could not afford. The city itself was a powder keg. Mobs roamed the streets, some crying for vengeance, others celebrating the death of the tyrant. The Liberators, led by the sanctimonious Brutus and the bitter Cassius, had badly misjudged the public mood. They expected to be hailed as heroes. Instead, they had simply unleashed the pack of wolves that Caesar had kept leashed. My departure could not be a grand royal procession. It had to be a silent flight in the dead of night. I liquidated what assets I could, gathered my most loyal servants, and secured my most precious possession, my son. We were ghosts, slipping through the fractured city while its new masters postured and plotted over Caesar's corpse. Every shadow seemed to hold a dagger. The journey to the port of Ostia was the longest of my life. Every cart that rattled past, every drunken shout from a tavern sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. The protection of Caesar had been an impenetrable shield. Now I was utterly exposed, a foreign queen on hostile soil, with the one thing his enemies would love to destroy, his only son. Boarding the ship, I felt the sea breeze as a physical release. As the shoreline of Italy faded into the darkness, I did not look back. Rome was a city of ghosts for me now, a place of grand ambitions and bloody ends. I was leaving the heart of the storm, returning to the ancient, steadfast security of my own land. The game had changed, and I needed to be on my own board to play it. The voyage home was a period of intense focus. The past was a closed chapter. The future was an unwritten scroll. I spent the days studying maps, reading reports from my agents, and formulating a new strategy for Egypt. The world was now divided between Caesar's assassins and Caesar's avengers. My task was to ensure Egypt not only survived the coming storm, but profited from it. My arrival in Alexandria was met with orchestrated celebrations, but I could feel the undercurrent of uncertainty. I had been away for 2 years. In my absence, my younger brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, had been keeping my throne warm. A boy I had married out of political necessity, but whose loyalty was, shall we say, unproven. A kingdom, like a garden, requires regular, diligent weeding. To ensure there was no confusion about the line of succession, my brother soon suffered from a rather sudden and incurable illness. It was terribly sad. More importantly, it was terribly necessary. It left the path clear for his replacement, a co-ruler whose loyalty was beyond question. I moved quickly to solidify my position. I formally elevated my 3-year-old son, Caesarion, to the throne as my co-ruler. He became Ptolemy the 15th Caesar, Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. The message was unmistakable. Egypt was now ruled by the son of a god, the progeny of the great Julius Caesar himself. My legitimacy was now divine. As Rome's factions began to sharpen their knives for the inevitable civil war, I made a public declaration of neutrality, a sensible position for a kingdom still finding its footing. Privately, however, my neutrality was strategic. Egypt became a quiet fortress of wealth and power, its granaries overflowing, its treasury growing. I would wait and see which of the Roman wolves emerged as the alpha. From the safety of Alexandria, I watched the drama in Rome unfold. It was better than any Greek tragedy. On one side were the liberators, Brutus and Cassius, scrambling to raise armies in the east, proclaiming their noble act while looting the provinces they controlled. They were fools, drunk on their own self-righteousness. On the other side were Caesar's avengers, a truly fascinating triumvirate of ambition. There was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal and formidable general, a man of great passions and appetites, a soldier, not a schemer. He was predictable and therefore manageable. Then there was the boy, Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son and heir. He was only 19, sickly and utterly underestimated by everyone, especially Antony. I saw the reports. I saw the cold, reptilian focus in his actions. He was not a wolf. He was a viper, patient and far more dangerous. He was the one to watch. This new triumvirate, with the forgotten Lepidus as their third wheel, began their reign with a bloodbath. They issued proscriptions, legalizing the murder of their political enemies. Thousands were killed, including the great orator Cicero, whose head and hands were famously nailed to the rostra in the Forum itself. I had made the correct decision to leave Rome. My head was far more secure on my own shoulders in Alexandria. While the triumvirs purged Italy, Brutus and Cassius amassed their forces in the east. Both sides needed ships, grain, and gold. Both sides sent envoys to the neutral Queen of Egypt. I played a delicate game, offering platitudes to both while committing to neither. I sent the 4 legions Caesar had left in Egypt to Antony and Octavian, a calculated gesture of support for his official heirs, but otherwise kept my resources to myself. The final confrontation came in the year 42 before the Common Era, at Philippi in Macedonia. The armies of the triumvirate, commanded by Antony and Octavian, crushed the armies of the liberators. Brutus and Cassius, seeing their noble cause lost, both fell on their own swords. It was a fittingly dramatic end for men who had unleashed so much chaos for the sake of an ideal. With the assassins dead, the Roman world was carved up between the victors. Octavian, the boy viper, shrewdly returned to Rome to handle the difficult business of settling veterans and consolidating power. The glamorous, wealthy, and problematic East fell to Mark Antony. His responsibility was to restore order and, more importantly, to squeeze the provinces for the money needed to pay their vast armies. And so my carefully maintained neutrality was about to be tested.
Mark Antony, master of the Roman East, summoned me to Tarsus to account for my actions. He expected a provincial queen to come scurrying, ready to grovel for his favor. A Roman general, accustomed to barking orders and being obeyed. He clearly did not know me. I took my time. I let him wait. Let him stew in the summer heat and wonder what sort of queen would dare to defy his summons. Power, you see, is often about managing expectations. I did not arrive as a defendant. I sailed up the river Cydnus in a manner designed to make a statement. My barge had a gilded stern, oars of silver that beat time to the music of flutes and lyres, and sails of the richest purple. Myself was reclining under a golden canopy, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. My attendants were Nereids and Graces, my page boys Cupids. The entire city of Tarsus emptied to witness the spectacle. Antony was left sitting alone on his tribunal, waiting to judge me. Instead, I invited him to a banquet aboard my ship. He came, he saw, he was conquered. Not by force of arms, but by a force far more potent, a spectacle so overwhelming it reshuffled the very dynamics of power. He came to put me in my place. Instead, he found himself a guest in mine. I had brought Egypt to him, and he was captivated. The charges against me, something about my supposed lukewarm support during his war against Caesar's assassins, evaporated like morning mist. They were a pretext, and my performance rendered them absurd. For several nights I entertained him with banquets of such opulence and wit that he, a man who prided himself on his own lavish tastes, was left speechless. I showed him that I was not just a queen, but his equal in spirit and his superior in style. Then came Antony, a powerful general, a passionate man. Less subtle than Caesar, perhaps, but with a grander vision. Caesar sought to control the world as it was. Antony was willing to break it and build a new one. In Tarsus, we recognized in each other a shared impatience with the small-mindedness of ordinary people, and a mutual love for life lived on an epic scale. The political alliance was sealed, but something far more potent had been ignited. He followed me back to Alexandria for the winter of 41 to 40 before the Common Era. Rome, with its endless backstabbing and tedious politics, seemed a world away. He cast off the cloak of the Roman general and embraced the life of the East. He was no longer a conqueror in my city, he was my partner. My people, who had been wary of Caesar, adored Antony. He drank with them, laughed with them, and treated them with an easy-going charm. We formed a society we called the Inimitable Livers. It was a circle dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure in its most exquisite forms. We held nightly feasts, elaborate games, and roamed the city streets in disguise, playing pranks on the unsuspecting citizens of Alexandria. It was a whirlwind of joyous indulgence, but it was also a strategy. I was binding him to me, to Egypt, weaving a web of pleasure and affection that Rome could never match. Beneath the feasting and the laughter, our bond deepened. Unlike my relationship with Caesar, which was a precise meeting of political minds, my connection with Antony was a fire. We shared a temperament, a certain recklessness, a belief that we were grand enough to forge our own destinies. In the quiet moments, we spoke not just of politics, but of a shared future, of a different kind of world. This idyll was shattered by news from Italy. Antony's ambitious wife Fulvia and his brother had instigated a disastrous civil war against his rival Octavian and lost. The political situation demanded his return. He left Alexandria in the spring of 40, a changed man, leaving me behind with a promise to return. He also left me with a more permanent reminder of our time together. I was pregnant. While Antony was in Rome, patching up his fragile alliance with the cold and calculating Octavian, I gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. I named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. These were not merely names, they were a declaration. They were the children of a new dawn, the heirs to a future empire of the East, a dynasty born of Roman might and Egyptian mystique. Antony, to secure his truce with Octavian, did what Roman aristocrats have always done. He married for politics. He took Octavia's elder sister, the noble and virtuous Octavia, as his wife. In Alexandria, I received the news with a cool pragmatism. I understood the political necessity. Octavia was a bandage on the wound of Roman politics. I was not a bandage. I was the blood in his veins. I could afford to be patient. For 3 long years I waited. Antony was entangled in Roman affairs and his marriage to Octavia, who bore him 2 daughters. During this time, I ruled Egypt alone. I was a pharaoh in my own right, not a consort. The kingdom prospered. I managed the economy, oversaw religious festivals, and raised my 3 children, Caesarion, my son by Caesar, and my twins by Antony. I was building my power base. Finally, in the year 37, the call came. Antony was planning his long-delayed, grandiose invasion of Parthia, Rome's great rival in the East. He needed money, supplies, and ships. He needed Egypt. He needed me. He summoned me to Antioch, and I went. The moment we were reunited, the intervening years and his Roman marriage melted away as if they had never been. Our partnership was renewed, stronger and more ambitious than ever before. He acknowledged our twins, and our passion gave us another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. He was no longer a visiting general. He was the father of my children, the co-architect of my dynastic plans. He spent another winter with me, planning the war that would make him the undisputed master of the world. His Parthian campaign was a military disaster. He lost nearly 1/3 of his army to the harsh landscape and Parthian tactics. Yet he returned from this catastrophe and declared it a victory, staging a bizarre triumphal parade not in Rome, as tradition demanded, but in the streets of Alexandria. He was consciously turning his back on Roman customs, choosing my capital as the center of his world. This culminated in the infamous ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria in the year 34. In the city's gymnasium, Antony and I sat upon golden thrones, elevated on a silver platform. I was dressed as Isis, he as Dionysus. It was the ultimate political statement. We were living gods, creating a new world order before the eyes of the public. To the assembled crowds, Antony declared that Caesarion was the true son and legal heir of Julius Caesar, a direct challenge to his rival Octavian, who built his entire career on being Caesar's adopted son. He then distributed the kingdoms of the East to our children. Our son Alexander Helios was named king of Armenia and the lands beyond the Euphrates. His twin, Cleopatra Selene, was made queen of Cyrene and Libya. Our youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was given Syria and Cilicia. We dreamed of an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, a beautiful dream, one that Rome found rather impolite. In their eyes, a Roman general was giving away Roman territories to his foreign mistress and their illegitimate children. For us, it was the dawn of a new Hellenistic empire, a fusion of Roman power and Eastern wealth, ruled by our dynasty. It was the moment our ambition finally overreached. In Rome, Octavian seized upon the donations with glee. Here was the proof he needed. He launched a vicious propaganda campaign, painting Antony as a drunken, decadent traitor, bewitched by an evil foreign queen. I was portrayed as the ultimate threat, a greedy sorceress who sought to move the capital of the world to Alexandria and enslave the Roman people. It was crude, but devastatingly effective. The final straw came when Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the Temple of Vesta and read its contents to the Senate. It confirmed Antony's parentage of my children and, most damningly, stated his desire to be buried beside me in Alexandria. To the Romans,
Every great story needs a great villain. Mine was not a monster of myth, but something far more chilling, a politician. While Antony and I dreamed in vibrant color of new empires and grand destinies, our nemesis saw the world in cold, hard shades of black and white. His name was Gaius Octavius, a name he would soon shed for one far greater. When Caesar's will was read, we were all surprised. He had posthumously adopted his grand-nephew, a frail, sickly boy of 18. Antony laughed. The great men of Rome scoffed. I admit I paid him little mind. He was a footnote, a minor inheritance. We all underestimated him. It was the single greatest mistake we all made, and we would pay for it with our lives and our worlds. Octavian, a pale, ambitious boy. He never understood passion, only power. He painted me as a monster, a seductress, a foreign threat. Very effective propaganda. The Roman people love a good villain, especially a foreign one. He lacked Caesar's charm and Antony's fire. He possessed something far more dangerous, a complete absence of sentiment, coupled with a terrifying, methodical patience. He immediately took the name Caesar. It was his first and most brilliant move. In the eyes of the legions and the common people of Rome, he was no longer just Octavian. He was the heir, the son of the deified Julius. He wrapped himself in his father's legacy like a cloak, and it gave him a legitimacy that Antony, for all his battlefield glory, could never claim. He wielded that name like a weapon, and it never missed its mark. While Antony was a lion, roaring and magnificent, Octavian was a spider. He spent his early years quietly weaving a web of alliances, obligations, and power in Rome. He understood the city's complex political machinery in a way Antony, the soldier, never did. He knew that wars were not won by armies alone, but by slander, by fear, and by turning public opinion into a weapon more devastating than any sword. His primary target was me. It was genius. To attack Antony directly would be to attack a fellow Roman, risking another messy civil war. But to attack me, that was a noble cause. I was the perfect enemy, foreign, female, powerful, and unapologetically wealthy. I was everything the ideal Roman matron was not, and he exploited that difference with surgical precision. He began a campaign of character assassination that was breathtaking in its scope and its viciousness. I was no longer the ruler of a sovereign kingdom, but a drunken harlot, the queen of whores. He spread tales that I practiced witchcraft, using potions and dark magic to enslave the noble Mark Antony.
I was a decadent Eastern despot who would bring ruin to the purity of Roman values. He used art to serve his lies. Coins were minted showing me with haggard, ugly features. Poems were commissioned portraying Antony as Hercules, bewitched and emasculated by his Omphale, a foreign queen who had stolen his manhood and his Roman spirit. Every rumor, every lie was designed to strip us of our humanity and turn us into monstrous caricatures. The donations of Alexandria were the greatest gift I ever gave him. Our grand ceremony, our dream of a new empire, he twisted into an act of treason. He told the people of Rome that Antony, their general, was giving away lands conquered by Roman blood to his foreign children. It was simple, it was infuriating, and it was a lie that everyone was eager to believe. His masterstroke was the affair of Antony's will. By seizing it from the sacred temple of Vesta, he committed a sacrilege that would have destroyed a lesser man, but the contents were his salvation. The confirmation that Antony wished to be buried beside me in Alexandria was the ultimate proof Antony had forsaken Rome. He had chosen the foreign witch over his homeland. While we celebrated our love and our divine right to rule in Alexandria, Octavian carefully cultivated his own image in Rome. He was the humble servant of the state, a defender of ancient traditions. He dressed simply. He lived modestly, at least in public. He was the champion of the Republic, the protector of the family, the man who would save Rome from the decadent, corrupting influence of the East. My influence. It was a battle of narratives, and his was simply better, or at least better suited to his audience. He understood the fears and prejudices of the Roman people, and he played upon them like a master musician. He made them fear me, hate me, and in doing so he united them behind him. It was no longer a power struggle between two men, it was a crusade for the soul of Rome. When he finally moved for a declaration of war, he had the full support of the Senate and the people, and in his final act of political genius, he had them declare war not on Antony, but on me. The official document was a declaration of war against Queen Cleopatra. I, a woman, was now the sworn enemy of the Roman state. Antony was relegated to the status of a private citizen fighting for a foreign power. The poison of his propaganda began to seep into our own camp. Roman senators and officers who had followed Antony out of loyalty began to waver. They had signed up to follow a Roman general, not to fight for the ambitions of an Egyptian queen. Desertions began as a trickle, then as a stream. Octavian was defeating us long before the first arrow was fired. Antony, a man of action, grew frustrated and angry. He was a soldier, and he wanted a soldier's battle. He was not equipped for this new kind of warfare, this war of whispers and lies. His temper flared, his decisions became more erratic, and he started to believe the caricatures himself, leaning into the role of the grand hedonistic king, further alienating his Roman followers. We made a fatal error. We trusted in our superior numbers, our greater wealth, and the power of our fleet. We possessed nearly 500 warships, many of them massive floating fortresses. We had the treasury of Egypt at our disposal. On paper, we were invincible. But wars are not fought on paper. Octavian had a weapon more valuable than all my gold, Marcus Vespanius Agrippa, a military commander of sheer, unadulterated genius. He was Octavian's opposite in many ways, a man of humble birth, gruff and practical, but he was utterly loyal and devastatingly effective. While Octavian wove the political web, Agrippa commanded the armies that would deliver the killing blow. Before the main battle, Agrippa began to tighten the noose. His faster, lighter ships outmaneuvered ours, capturing key supply points and cutting off our communication lines. He trapped our grand fleet within the Ambracian Gulf near Actium. Our vast army stationed on the shore began to suffer from malaria and starvation. Our material advantage was being systematically dismantled by superior strategy. A council of war was held. Antony's generals begged him to abandon the fleet and march the army overland to fight in Greece or Macedonia, where his legions were still superior. It was the sensible military solution. But I could not abandon my fleet. 200 Egyptian warships represented the power and pride of my kingdom. I argued for a naval battle, a decisive breakout. Antony, torn between his generals and me, sided with me. The decision was made. We would fight at sea. Our plan was not to win a total victory, but to break through the blockade with the strongest part of our fleet and the treasury ships. We would escape to Egypt, regroup, and continue the war from there. It was a retreat disguised as an attack, a desperate gamble. So we came to the eve of battle, the 2nd of September, in the year 31 before the Common Era. Across the water we could see the campfires of Octavian's legions, disciplined and silent. Our camp was a cacophony of different languages, of doubt, and of Antony's forced bravado. The air was thick with the sense of an ending. This was more than a battle for a throne. It was the final, violent clash between two irreconcilable worlds.
The morning of the 2nd of September, 31 before the Common Era, dawned with a deceptive calm. A heavy mist hung over the Ionian Sea, muffling the sounds of our fleet preparing for the end of the world. The air was thick with the smell of pitch, sweat, and fear. On my flagship, the Antonia, I watched as our great ships, our pride, prepared to meet their destiny. It was a perfect day for a tragedy. Our fleet was a marvel of naval architecture, a forest of masts and towering wooden citadels. We possessed massive quinquiriums and even larger vessels, ships designed to overwhelm with sheer size and brute force. They were magnificent, intimidating, and, as it turned out, terribly slow, floating fortresses in an age that now demanded speed. Facing us was Octavian's navy, commanded by the brilliant Marcus Agrippa. His ships were a mockery of ours, smaller, lighter, Liburnian galleys, a swarm of hungry wolves facing a herd of elephants. They were fast, agile, and crewed by sailors who had spent months training for this very day, while our crews were ravaged by sickness and despair. We had spectacle, they had lethal efficiency. Our strategy was born of desperation. A full victory was no longer possible. The plan was for me to command a squadron of 60 of my fastest Egyptian ships, break through the center of Agrippa's line, and escape to Egypt with our war treasury. Antony, with the bulk of the fleet, was to engage the enemy, create the opening for me, and then follow. It was, from its conception, a retreat. For hours nothing happened. The two great fleets faced each other in the mouth of the Gulf, drifting on a glassy sea. The wind we needed to fill our great sails refused to appear. It was a battle of nerves, a silent, agonizing prelude. Agrippa was a patient predator. He refused to attack us head-on, knowing our heavy ships were deadly in a close-quarters brawl. He simply waited, letting the sun and our own anxiety cook us in our armor. Antony was a man of action, a land general who understood the glorious, straightforward chaos of a legionary charge. This naval chess match was torture for him. He paced the deck of his flagship, his frustration a palpable force. He was a lion in a cage built of water, and Agrippa, the zookeeper, held the keys, refusing to open the door until the time was right. Then, around midday, a breeze picked up from the sea. It was the sign. The wind we had prayed for filled our great square sails. The time for waiting was over. The horn sounded, a deep, mournful cry across the water. Our squadron surged forward, our great oars churning the sea into white foam. The world erupted into a symphony of violence. The battle, when it was finally joined, was not the heroic clash we had imagined. It was a chaotic, brutal mess. Agrippa's smaller ships swarmed our lumbering giants. They were too nimble to be rammed, darting in and out, peppering our decks with arrows, javelins, and pots of burning pitch. They were wasps stinging a bull to death. They had a terrifying new weapon, a grappling device called the harpax. Fired from a catapult, it would lodge its iron claw deep into the hull of our ships. From there, they could either winch themselves in for boarding, or, more horribly, simply hold a ship fast, a helpless target for their other vessels to destroy at their leisure. It was brutally, devastatingly effective. From the deck of my flagship, the battle was a vision of hell. Smoke choked the air, smelling of burning wood and men. The sea was littered with splintered timbers, broken oars, and the bodies of the drowning. The shouts of commanders and the screams of the wounded were a constant chorus. It was a maelstrom of confusion, a place where strategy died and only survival mattered. My squadron, with sails full and momentum on our side, smashed through a weakened point in the enemy line. We had done it. The plan, our desperate final gamble, had worked. I was through, the war chest was safe, and the open sea lay before me. I gave the signal, a large purple sail hoisted on my flagship, for Antony to see that the way was clear. It was here, at this critical moment, that the future of the world was decided. Antony, seeing my signal, seeing me break through, made his choice. He abandoned his flagship, his command, his thousands of men who were still fighting and dying for him. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship, and with a handful of vessels, he followed me. He chose me over his army. He chose love over honor. The effect of his departure on the fleet was immediate and catastrophic. A leader's duty is to lead, especially in the face of disaster. When the men saw their general fleeing the battle, their spirit broke. The heart was torn from our navy. What had been a desperate fight for survival turned into a panicked, disorganized rout. Actium, the sea, once my domain, turned against us. Ships burned, dreams drowned. It was less a battle, more a very wet, very expensive funeral for an empire that never quite was. Our grand fleet reduced to driftwood. Agrippa's ships now swarmed the remnants of our navy, who were leaderless and demoralized. The sea itself seemed to be on fire as our great ships became floating pyres. Without a commander, with no hope of victory, entire squadrons began to surrender. Captains lowered their banners and ordered their men to raise their oars in a sign of submission. The will to fight had been extinguished with Antony's flight. The greatest fleet the East had ever assembled was annihilated in a single afternoon. On the shore, our 19 legions, some of the finest soldiers in the Roman world, watched this disaster unfold, powerless to intervene. They had been Antony's greatest strength, and we had let them wither on the land while we gambled everything on the sea. They would hold out for a week, hoping for his return, before surrendering to Octavian. An entire army lost without a single legionary clash. Our escape was a grim, silent affair. Antony was brought aboard my ship. He did not speak. He walked to the prow and sat alone, his head in his hands, refusing to look at me or speak to anyone for 3 days. The great, roaring lion of Rome was gone, replaced by a broken man, crushed by the weight of his own shame and the magnitude of our failure. We had lost more than 200 ships, with thousands of sailors and soldiers killed or drowned. Another 50,000 men of our land and sea forces were captured or had surrendered. In the space of a few hours, the great military might we had spent years accumulating had been wiped from existence. The dream of our Eastern Empire had died. Octavian, ever the master of narrative, had his victory. He did not need to embellish it. The truth was damning enough. The great Mark Antony had abandoned his men in the heat of battle to chase after his Egyptian queen. It was the perfect final confirmation of every piece of propaganda he had ever spun. He had been proven right in the most spectacular way imaginable. The journey back to Egypt was a funeral procession. The wind that carried us home felt like a mournful sigh. We were returning not as triumphant monarchs of a new empire, but as fugitives. The sea had betrayed us, or perhaps we had betrayed ourselves, our ambition finally undone by a fatal combination of love and flawed strategy. Our grand ambition ended in a catastrophic rout, but the story was not yet over. The final desperate stand in Alexandria was still to come. To witness the last days of a queen, the fall of a city, and the tragic end of a legendary love affair, you must subscribe to this broadcast. The conclusion is as unforgettable as the dream that preceded it.
The journey back from Actium was a voyage through the 5 stages of grief undertaken on the open sea. For days, Mark Antony sat at the prow of my ship, a living statue of despair. The great general, the roaring lion of Rome, was a ghost, shrouded in a silence more profound than any battle cry. He stared at the waves that had swallowed his honor, a man drowned in shame while still breathing. My role, once his partner in forging an empire, was now reduced to that of a minder. While my own heart was a stone in my chest, I had to project strength. I had to manage the retreat, to plot our next move, to hold together the shattered remnants of our dream. I approached him, tried to speak to him, to coax him back to the world of the living. It was like trying to reason with a storm. We made landfall at Paratonium, a port in Libya. The news that greeted us was a fresh twist of the knife. The 4 Roman legions Antony had stationed there, legions he had trusted, had already heard of the disaster at Actium. They had promptly declared their allegiance to Octavian. The rot of betrayal was spreading faster than we could sail, a plague carried on the wind. This final abandonment shattered what little remained of Antony's spirit. In his tent, the man who had commanded armies and held the fate of millions in his hands tried to end his own life. It was his loyal officers who stopped him, who physically restrained their broken commander from falling on his sword. He was a giant felled not by an enemy, but by the crushing weight of his own failure. We fled, back to Egypt, my beloved home, now a trap. Octavian's legions, like vultures circling, the air grew heavy with their dust and our despair. Very unpharaonic, this feeling. Upon reaching Alexandria, we had to perform our first lie. I had my ships decorated with laurels, my sailors cheering as if we were returning from a great triumph. The city had to believe we were still strong. The charade of our final year had begun. Antony had no stomach for such performances. He wanted no part in the governance of a doomed kingdom. He retreated from the palace, from me, from himself.
By the harbor, he built a small, isolated house, naming it his Timonium, after a legendary Athenian recluse who despised all of humanity. There he intended to live out his days alone, a hermit king brooding over the ruins of his life. While Antony communed with his misery, I worked. A queen does not have the luxury of despair. I had a kingdom to protect, children whose future I had to secure. I became ruthless. Any nobleman in Alexandria I suspected of wavering loyalty was executed, his property confiscated to fund the hiring of new mercenaries. I was a cornered lioness, and my claws were sharp. My mind raced, concocting plans that bordered on madness, born of sheer desperation. My grandest, most audacious scheme was to haul my remaining fleet over the desert land bridge from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. From there we could escape our fate, sail to Arabia, perhaps even India, and start a new empire far from the reach of Rome. It was a magnificent, impossible dream, and it died when local tribes, encouraged by one of Octavian's allies, burned the first ships we dragged across the sands. In the city, we maintained a frantic, almost hysterical facade of normality. We threw lavish parties that felt more like funerals. We celebrated Caesareon's official coming of age, dressing my teenage son in the robes of a man and parading him through the city. It was a hollow gesture, presenting a new king to a kingdom that would likely not exist in a few months. We were ghosts, hosting our own wake. The pleasure society we had once founded, the inimitable livers, was a bitter memory of a more hopeful time. We dissolved it. In its place, we formed a new society, a club with a much more fitting name, the Synapothenoumenoi, which means those who will die together. Our feasts continued, but now they were rehearsals for the end, each toast a farewell. Even as I prepared for death, I fought for life. I began a desperate secret correspondence with Octavian. I sent him offers one after another. I would abrogate. I would relinquish my kingdom. All I asked was that he allow my children to rule in my place. Let my dynasty survive, even if I did not. I was no longer negotiating as a monarch, but as a mother trying to save her young. Octavian, from his position of absolute power, played a cruel and leisurely game. He responded to my pleas with vague half-promises, but he had one consistent, chilling offer. He would show me mercy, he would be generous, he might even let me keep my kingdom on one condition, that I deliver Mark Antony to him. He wanted me to betray the man I loved, to be the final instrument of his destruction. While he tempted me with these poisonous bargains, his armies were on the march. The world we had once commanded was now his. He advanced slowly, methodically from the east, through Syria and Judea, consolidating his power, gathering his forces. To the west, his general, Cornelius Gallus, marched on Parætonium, mopping up the last of Antony's former garrisons. The jaws of the trap were closing. The fortress of Pelusium, the great eastern gateway to Egypt, fell to Octavian with barely a fight. The news struck Alexandria like a physical blow. Rumors flew, many whispered by Octavian's own agents, that I myself had ordered the commander to surrender, a final desperate attempt to win the victor's favor. The truth was lost in the ensuing panic. The imminent danger finally roused Antony from his self-pity. The news that Octavian's legions were marching on the capital itself reignited a spark of the old soldier. He emerged from his hermitage, strapped on his armor, and decided to fight. The lion, it seemed, had one last roar left in him. He gathered what was left of our cavalry and led them in a furious, desperate charge against Octavian's vanguard just outside the city gates. And he won.
For one brief, glorious afternoon, the old Antony was back. He drove the enemy back in confusion, returning to the palace covered in dust and blood, triumphant and laughing. We celebrated that small, meaningless victory as if we had turned the tide of the war. Antony was giddy with success, preening and boasting as he had in his glory days. I indulged him. We all did. It was a beautiful, shared delusion, a last drink of water in a desert of despair. It gave him the courage for one final, hopeless plan. Buoyed by his success, he decided he would meet Octavian in a full-scale battle the next day, the 1st of August. He would attack with his remaining infantry on land, while what was left of our fleet, docked in the great harbor, would sail out and engage Octavian's navy. It was to be our last stand. That night, a strange story spread through the anxious city. It was said that in the darkest hours, a mysterious sound was heard drifting through the streets, the ethereal music of pipes and lutes, the faint sound of cymbals and joyous cries. It was the sound of a Bacchic procession, the sound of the god Dionysus abandoning his chosen vessel and the city of Alexandria to its fate. The final day dawned, the 1st of August in the year 30 before the Common Era. Antony stood on a piece of high ground overlooking the harbor, resplendent in his armor, ready to watch his navy sail out to a glorious victory. He watched as our ships rode out in perfect formation, a brave sight. Then came the final betrayal. As our fleet approached Octavian's, it did not fire a single arrow. Instead, in perfect unison, the sailors raised their oars in salute to the enemy. They turned their ships and joined Octavian's navy. They had defected, all of them. Antony watched in stunned disbelief as his navy abandoned him. At the same time, his cavalry, seeing the fleet's betrayal, deserted him on the battlefield. His infantry, leaderless and heartbroken, were swiftly defeated. In a matter of moments, his entire remaining force had evaporated. Everything was gone. The great general, utterly defeated and now consumed by paranoia, turned his rage on the only person left to blame. He rushed back into the city, into the palace, his sword drawn, screaming my name. He screamed that I had betrayed him, that I had made a deal with Octavian, that I had orchestrated this. The final collapse was a storm of chaos and fear. When Antony, his face a mask of thunderous rage, burst into the palace screaming my name, he was no longer the man I loved. He was a wounded beast, cornered and betrayed by the world, and in his madness he had decided I was the author of his pain. He came for me with a sword in his hand and murder in his eyes. I did what any sensible queen would do when faced with a distraught, heavily armed lover convinced of her treachery. I ran. With my two most devoted attendants, Iris and Charmion, at my heels, we fled through the palace corridors. There was only one place to go, one sanctuary strong enough to keep his rage and the encroaching Romans at bay. My tomb, my mausoleum. I had designed it years before as a monument to my eternal glory, a fortress of fine marble meant to protect my body and treasures for all time. It was built to defy the centuries. On this day, I would ask it to defy a broken heart and a conquering army. It would become my last palace and my last prison. Once inside, we heaved against the massive stone doors, sliding the heavy bars into place. The sound of them locking echoed with a dreadful finality. We were sealed in, safe for the moment from the chaos outside. But safety is just another word for being trapped when the world outside your door belongs to your enemy. From the high window of the tomb, I could see the city descending into turmoil. Antony was still somewhere in the palace grounds, a whirlwind of grief and fury. His rage was a danger to himself. I had to stop him. And so, in a moment of desperate, flawed logic, I decided to fight his madness with a lie, a terrible, calculated lie meant to shock him back to his senses. I summoned a loyal messenger to the gates of the tomb. I gave him a simple, brutal message to deliver to Antony. A message I thought would douse the flames of his rage with the cold water of grief. The message was this: I, Cleopatra, was dead. I had taken my own life rather than face defeat. It was a strategic falsehood. I could not have predicted his reaction. The news reached Antony in the palace. My messenger delivered the fatal lie. He told Antony that his queen was no more. The effect was not what I had intended. His rage did not subside into thoughtful grief. It transformed instantly into an abyss of utter despair. The world without me in it was a place he no longer wished to inhabit. His Roman soul, obsessed with honor, saw only one path forward. He turned to his armor-bearer, a man named Eros, to whom he had long ago administered an oath. He had made the man swear that if the day ever came when Antony needed an honorable death, Eros would be the one to provide it. Antony, the great general, now invoked that terrible promise. He handed Eros his sword and ordered his faithful servant to kill him. But Eros, for all his oaths, could not bring himself to strike the master he loved. He took the sword from Antony, spoke a final farewell, and then, in a heartbreaking act of loyalty, turned the blade upon himself. He fell dead at Antony's feet, a servant who chose to die rather than become his master's executioner. His loyalty was more profound than Antony's despair. Now Antony was truly alone. "Well done, Eros," he whispered to the body of his servant. "You have shown your master how it is done." He took up the sword. He spoke my name, commending what he believed was my courage, my final act as a queen. Then, with all his remaining strength, he fell upon the blade, seeking the oblivion he thought I had already found. It was a soldier's death, but poorly executed. The sword stroke was not clean. It missed his heart. The wound was mortal, but it was not swift. He lay on the floor, bleeding, in agony, dying by inches. It was in this wretched state that another messenger arrived, this one with the truth. The queen was not dead. She was alive, barricaded in her tomb. Antony's final wish was born in that moment of agony and relief. He had to see me. He begged his guards, the few who had not deserted him, to carry him to me. He wanted to die in my arms, not alone on the cold palace floor. His life was draining away, but he would spend his last few breaths with me. They brought him to the foot of the mausoleum, a small, sad procession carrying their dying general. I looked down from the high window, and the sight broke what was left of my heart. There he was, my Antony, pale and drenched in his own blood, his eyes searching for me. We could not open the doors. Octavian's men were now swarming the grounds. There was only one way. We lowered ropes and heavy linen slings from the window. The three of us, my two ladies and I, a queen and her handmaidens, began the grim task of hauling the armored, dying body of Mark Antony up the sheer marble face of my tomb. It was a scene of grotesque, desperate intimacy. The strain was immense. He was a heavy man, and we were not built for such labors. The ropes cut into our hands. His groans of pain with every jolt were a torment. It was the most undignified ascent a great man ever made, a final, agonizing climb into the arms of the woman for whom he had lost the world. We finally dragged him through the window and laid him on a couch. I was covered in his blood. I cradled his head in my lap. All the lies, all the betrayals, all the paranoia, it all vanished. There was only this, the last moments of the man I loved. He was dying, and he was with me. His breath came in ragged gasps. He asked for a drink of wine, one last taste of the life he had so loved. He told me not to grieve for him, but to remember him in his glory, not in this pathetic, bloody end. He urged me to trust only one of Octavian's officers, a man named Julius, in my negotiations. Even in death, he tried to protect me. Antony, my lion. He fought bravely, but bravely does not win against overwhelming force. His death, a final, agonizing betrayal, of fate, of Rome, of everything. It left a rather large hole in my royal bed. As he took his final breath, a part of me died with him. My wild, unrestrained grief filled the silent tomb. The queen was gone for a moment, and only a woman remained. The sound of my own keen cries was what brought me back to myself. Below, the world was moving on. Octavian's men, led by that same Julius Antony had named, were at the door. They had come for the victor's prize, the living Queen of Egypt. I was to be the final jewel in Octavian's triumph. I spoke to them through the barred doors. I demanded that my kingdom be passed to my children. I negotiated even then, with the body of my love still warm beside me. The game was not quite over, but I was alone in a tomb, with my greatest ally silenced forever. Antony's end was messy, tragic, and deeply human. He was a man of colossal appetites and colossal flaws, a hero from a bygone age who could not adapt to a world that no longer had room for men like him. He was the last of the great, passionate, flawed titans, and now he was gone. My lover is dead. My enemy is at the door. I am a queen with no kingdom, a mother with no future to give her children. What happens when the irresistible force of my will meets the immovable object of Octavian's ambition? Subscribe to our broadcast to witness the final confrontation, the last stand of the last Queen of Egypt.
Antony gone, a profound silence fell upon my tomb, broken only by my own grief and the shuffling feet of Roman soldiers outside my door. My world had shrunk to a single marble room containing one dead love and one living enemy. Octavian's men, led by the very Proculeius Antony had told me to trust, called to me through the barred gate, offering gentle words and poisoned promises. They wanted me alive. That much was obvious. I was the star prize, the final piece needed to complete Octavian's grand victory narrative. While Proculeius engaged me in conversation at the main door, distracting me with false negotiations for my children's safety, another group of his soldiers was finding a less dignified entrance. They scaled the back of the mausoleum, a feat of military climbing, and slipped in through the high window we had used for Antony. The moment of capture was a blur of shock and violation.
I was turning from the gate when I heard a gasp from Charmian. I spun around to see Roman legionaries dropping into my sanctuary. My final refuge had been breached. Instinct took over. Before they could reach me, I snatched a dagger I had hidden in my robes, intending to deny them their prize. I would not be taken. But Proculeius was fast. He lunged, grabbing my arm, twisting the dagger from my hand. "Cleopatra, you wrong both yourself and Caesar," he said, his voice smooth and condescending, as if he were saving a child from a tantrum. I was disarmed, surrounded, and utterly, completely defeated. My attempt to choose my own end had failed. For now. They escorted me from my tomb, the place of my intended death, back to my own palace. The irony was suffocating. I was now a prisoner in the very halls where I had once reigned as a living goddess. Roman guards stood at my doors, watched my every move. I was a queen in a cage of my own gold, my every comfort a reminder of my powerlessness. He came. The cold, calculating boy. He wanted me, as a prize, to be paraded in Rome like a circus animal, a queen, a goddess, reduced to a spectacle. Unacceptable, utterly unacceptable. My ancestors would turn in their tombs if they weren't already there. This single thought became the guiding star of my final days. There would be no Roman triumph for me. Octavian's entire war had been built on the idea of conquering me. His victory parade in Rome would be a hollow affair without the great foreign queen in chains, paraded through the streets for the jeering mobs. He needed me alive, shamed and broken. This knowledge gave me my last remaining weapon, my own life. I began my resistance in the only way left to me. I refused to eat. If my body grew weak and wasted away, if I succumbed to a fever brought on by my grief and self-inflicted wounds, I would be a poor spectacle for his parade. A hunger strike was a quiet, dignified rebellion, a queen's final attempt to control her own fate. Octavian, ever the pragmatist, saw my plan at once. He did not plead or reason. He simply sent a message. His cruelty was as efficient as his ambition. If I did not eat, if I harmed myself in any way, he would visit his displeasure upon my children. He would make them suffer for my defiance. It was a perfect, monstrous checkmate. To save them, I had to live. So I ate. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing torment. I was treated with a cold, correct courtesy. My every need was met, but I was watched constantly. My food was checked for poison. My attendants were spies. I was a hawk in a gilded cage, my wings clipped, my every movement observed by my captor, who was waiting for my spirit to break. Then the summons. Octavian would grant me an audience. He would come to me in my prison palace. The final confrontation between the victor and the vanquished was at hand. I began to prepare, not as a queen preparing for a diplomatic meeting, but as an actress preparing for the role of a lifetime. I chose my costume with care. No royal robes, no jewels, no elaborate makeup. I would meet him as a woman shattered by grief. My hair would be unkempt, my face puffy and tear-stained from my mourning. My clothes would be the simple dark robes of a widow. My sorrow would be my shield, my grief for Antony, my last remaining weapon. The stage was set. I had my chambers filled with the busts and portraits of his adopted father, my great love, Julius Caesar. I would surround this pale imitation with reminders of the original. I would force him to conduct this interview under the watchful marble eyes of the man whose name gave him power, a name I had known with an intimacy he could never comprehend. He entered the room, and I saw him for the first time. He was as I had imagined him, slender, controlled, with cold eyes that seemed to absorb all light and reflect nothing. There was no passion in him, only a chilling, relentless purpose. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who has never known a moment of doubt or a single moment of true, reckless joy. My performance began. I threw myself at his feet, not as Cleopatra the queen, but as a weeping, desperate woman. I groveled. I pleaded for my life, for the lives of my children. I showed him letters, love letters, written in his own father's hand, pressing them to my breast, reminding him of the bond I had shared with the deified Julius Caesar. I appealed to his legacy, his pride, his capacity for mercy. I used every tool of rhetoric and emotion I possessed. I, who had charmed Caesar and loved Antony, deployed my full arsenal against this boy. I might as well have been speaking to a statue. He listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When I had exhausted myself, he replied with cool, empty platitudes. "Be of good heart, woman, and keep up your spirits, for no harm will be done to you." They were the meaningless reassurances one gives to a frightened animal before leading it to the slaughter. Pity and sentiment had failed. I switched tactics. My grief-stricken persona vanished, replaced by a more pragmatic one. I presented him with a detailed inventory of all my royal treasures, my gold, my pearls, my emeralds. I would show him that I was now concerned only with material things, with securing my own future. As we reviewed the list, my treasurer, who was in on the deception, rushed forward and accused me of holding back my most valuable jewels. I feigned anger at this betrayal. It was a carefully staged piece of theater, designed for an audience of one. It was meant to convince Octavian that I was clinging to life, that I was hiding treasures for a future I still intended to have. The ruse worked perfectly. A flicker of what might have been a smile touched Octavian's thin lips. He believed he had broken me. He saw a woman no longer dreaming of empires, but haggling over her severance package. He left my chambers, satisfied that the great Cleopatra was now a manageable problem, a prize that would be delivered to Rome without further trouble. He was a fool. The moment he was gone, the mask dropped. The cold fury returned. He had seen what I wanted him to see. He believed I would submit. He believed he had won. This final deception was my secret victory, the key to my final escape. I had lulled my jailer into a false sense of security. A few days later, my freedom came in the form of a secret message. A young Roman officer named Cornelius Dolabella, who had been captivated by my story, or perhaps just pitied me, sent word. He warned me that Octavian's patience was at the end. In 3 days, I and my children were to be put on a ship and sent to Italy. The triumph was imminent. The clock was ticking. I made one last request of Octavian. I asked for permission to visit Antony's tomb to make final offerings to his spirit. The request, coming from a woman he now believed to be defeated and compliant, seemed harmless, a final, sentimental gesture. He granted it. It was the last mistake he would ever make in his dealings with me. I made my preparations. I ordered a final lavish banquet.
In my final moments, as I prepared for my last great journey, my thoughts were not of empires or of gods. They were of my children. They were the true Egypt, the living legacy I had fought for.
the flesh and blood continuation of a line that stretched back to Alexander himself. All my ambition, all my alliances, all my love affairs, they were all, in the end, for them. I had four bright flames I had hoped would illuminate the world, now about to be extinguished by the cold Roman wind. They were not just children, they were political statements, anchors for a future that had now sunk beneath the waves. Each one a king or queen in a kingdom of dreams, a world we had mapped out in the heady days of power. There was my firstborn, my Caesarion, son of the divine Julius. Then my twins by Antony, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, my sun and my moon, born to rule the East. And my youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, a sweet boy destined for a throne that no longer existed. They were the children of kings, and they inherited the most dangerous legacy of all, acclaim. Theirs were not the easy lives of ordinary children. They were born into a world of power and peril, their very existence a challenge to the established order. I had given them crowns in their cradles, and in doing so I had painted targets on their backs. This was the terrible calculus of royalty, a truth every monarch understands. My children, the true legacy. Caesarion, my son by the great Caesar. Octavian, his jealous heir, will not suffer such a challenge to his claim. A mother's heart breaks, but a queen's duty demands a final act of protection, even in defeat. My own end was not an act of despair, but my last political maneuver. By dying, I hoped to remove the justification for Octavian's wrath, to perhaps buy their lives with my own. My greatest fear, my most certain sorrow, was for Caesarion, my son, Ptolemy the 15th Caesar, King of kings, Lord of lords. He was the living refutation of Octavian's entire identity. Octavian built his career on being the adopted son of a god. But Caesarion was the blood of the god himself, born of Caesar's only known son. In Rome, they have a saying, "It is not good to have too many Caesars," a grimly practical piece of political advice. As long as my son drew breath, Octavian's position was not entirely secure. There would always be a faction, an ambitious senator, a rebellious general who might see in Caesarion a more legitimate rallying point. The boy had to die. There was no other possibility. I had known this. I had tried to save him. Weeks before the end, I had sent him away from Alexandria, south along the Nile towards the safety of Nubia. From there, his tutors were to take him east, across the sea, to India, a land so vast and distant that even Rome's long arm could not reach him. He left with a great treasure, a king in secret exile. But my plan was undone by the naivete of a scholar. His tutor, a man named Rhodan, believed in the power of reason and mercy, qualities utterly absent in Roman politics. He convinced my son to turn back. He argued that Octavian would surely be lenient, that he would allow Caesarion to live as a private citizen, perhaps even a client king. He filled my son's head with foolish hopes. And so Caesarion, a boy of 17, was persuaded to return, to place his life in the hands of the one man in the world who had the most to gain for his death. My heart shatters to think of it. My carefully laid plan for his survival undone by a misplaced belief in a tyrant's better nature. A mother's greatest effort thwarted by a fool. I know what his fate will be. As I sit here waiting, I know that Octavian has already given the order. Somewhere, my son,
My beautiful, intelligent boy, the son of the great Caesar, will be quietly, efficiently, and ruthlessly executed. With him dies the last direct bloodline of the man who conquered the world. My 3 children by Antony are a different matter. They do not pose the same existential threat to Octavian. They are the children of a defeated Roman, not a rival to his divine parentage. For them there is a chance, however slim, of survival. A chance purchased at the price of utter humiliation. They will be taken to Rome. They will be spared for now, because they are more valuable alive. They are the props Octavian needs for his grand triumph. I can see it now, my young children, Alexander, Cleopatra, and little Ptolemy, forced to walk through the streets of Rome in golden chains, exotic curiosities for the mob to gawk at. The children of the great foreign queen, reduced to trophies. The thought of it is a physical pain. The indignity I am about to escape by my own hand will be forced upon them. They will make me walk in my place. It is a mother's greatest nightmare to know that their children will suffer the shame she would not. But they must live. That is all that matters now. And what will become of them after the parade is over? The greatest and most bitter irony of all. They will be given into the care of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, the woman I displaced. A final posthumous victory for her. My children, raised in the household of my rival. One must admire the exquisite cruelty of Roman politics. I know in my heart that my sons by Antony, Alexander Helios, and Ptolemy Philadelphus will not live long. History has little room for the sons of vanquished kings. They will be raised in gilded cages, watched constantly, and will likely fade away from some convenient illness before they reach manhood. They are loose ends, and Octavian is a man who likes his accounts settled. But my daughter, Cleopatra Selene, my moon, in her I place my final hope. She is fierce and intelligent like me. She has the fire of Antony and the mind of a Ptolemy. She will survive. I feel it. She is not a direct threat as a woman, and she can be used for a political marriage. She can be useful to Octavian, and the useful survive. And she will. I see her future in my mind's eye. She will marry a king, Juba II of Mauritania, another royal orphan raised in Rome. Together they will rule a prosperous kingdom. She will build a new capital, Caesarea, in honor of the man who destroyed her family. Another bitter irony. She will fill her court with artists and scholars, creating a little Alexandria by the Western Sea. Through her, the blood of the Ptolemies will flow on. My legacy will not be entirely extinguished. It will be a small, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness of the Roman Empire, but it will be a light nonetheless. My name and the memory of our world will live on through my daughter, the Queen of Mauritania. It is my only consolation. So I say farewell to them now in the silence of my heart. Farewell to Caesarion, my King of Kings, my first and greatest hope. Farewell to Alexander and Ptolemy, my bright, brave boys. And a final blessing upon you, Cleopatra Selene, my moon. Survive, remember, and rule well. The Ptolemaic dynasty did not begin with me, but it ends with me. 300 years of pharaohs, of glory, of intrigue, of power. I am the last. My death is not just a personal choice. It is the closing of a book, the end of an age. Egypt will become a province,
a personal possession of the man who defeated me. I have done all I can. I have loved with the force of a tempest. I have ruled as a true pharaoh. I have borne children to the greatest men of my time, and I have tried and failed to build a new world. Now there is nothing left to do but to meet the gods as a queen. My life was a testament to ambition, love, and the will to power, but my death will be a testament to my ultimate legacy, my children. Their story does not end.
The 10th of August in the year 30 before the Common Era. This was to be my last day on earth. Octavian, my captor, had been lulled into a false sense of security. He believed I was a broken woman, preparing for a life of quiet, comfortable exile. He had even granted my final request, permission to pay my last respects at Antony's tomb. The visit was my final performance for my Roman gods. I wept, I wailed, I laid wreaths upon his tomb, and I spoke to his spirit as a grieving lover. It was a convincing show. They saw not a queen plotting her final defiance, but a broken-hearted woman lost in her sorrow. They pitied me. Pity is a useful tool when dealing with the unimaginative. I returned to my own mausoleum, my final stage. I informed my guards that I wished to perform sacred rites and be left in peace. They agreed, suspecting nothing. My loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian, were with me. We ordered a final banquet to be brought, a last feast to honor a life that had been lived as a feast itself. There would be no sadness in my final hours, only a celebration of what had been. The means of my escape arrived with the most perfect mundanity. A man from the countryside, a simple farmer, came to the tomb with a basket of fresh figs, an offering for the queen's meal. The Roman guards, looking for assassins with swords, not peasants with fruit, inspected the basket casually and waved him through. It pays to understand your enemy's lack of imagination. Beneath the heavy, sweet figs, nestled among the leaves, was my royal chariot to the afterlife. A small serpent, an asp. To the Romans, it was a venomous snake. To me, it was a sacred creature, the instrument of the gods. Its bite did not bring a painful, ugly death, but a gentle sleep, a drift into immortality. It was the chosen exit of pharaohs. It was my key to freedom. With the doors barred and our final meal concluded, the last ritual began. I dismissed all but Iris and Charmian, the two women who were my shadows, my friends, my final loyal subjects. I bathed my body one last time, anointing my skin with the most fragrant and expensive oils. I would not meet eternity smelling of fear. Then they dressed me, not in the simple dark robes of a Roman prisoner, but in the full, magnificent regalia of a queen of Egypt. I wore the robes of the goddess Isis, the divine mother from whom I claimed descent. Upon my head they placed the diadem of the Ptolemies. I would meet my end not as Octavian's captive, but as the pharaoh I had always been. The final piece of the plan was set in motion. I took the letter I had written, the one addressed to Octavian, and handed it to a trusted servant to deliver. The message inside was simple. It was my last will and testament, and my final request was to be buried beside my beloved Antony. The moment he read those words, he would understand everything. But by then, it would be far too late. My two dear ladies prepared themselves. Their loyalty was so absolute, their love for me so profound, that they had chosen to accompany me on this final journey. There were no tears, only a quiet, resolute purpose. We had lived as a queen and her court, and so we would die. They wanted me in chains, to be mocked, to be paraded. A queen does not suffer such indignity. A pharaoh chooses her own exit. And I, my friends, always choose the grandest exit, one they could never control. A final, exquisite act of rebellion. Iris went first. As she finished arranging my crown, ensuring every detail was perfect for my final presentation, she swayed and fell at my feet. She had found her own means of release, sparing herself the final moments of my departure. She lay there, a loyal servant, at the foot of her queen's throne, already at peace. Then it was my turn. I reached into the basket of figs and took out the serpent. It was not a monster. It was a small, elegant creature, a swift and merciful messenger. I held it to my breast, its cool scales a strange comfort against my skin. There was a sharp sting, a sudden fire, and then nothing. A gentle numbness began to creep through my veins, a slow, quiet tide pulling me out to a peaceful sea. The death it offered was not the writhing, agonizing end of common poisons. It was a royal death, a lethargy, a gentle heaviness, a slow shutting down of the senses. I laid myself down upon my golden couch, arranged my robes, and composed myself for eternity. Charmian, my last faithful companion, stood beside me. In his headquarters, Octavian received my letter. He broke the seal and read my final words. The calm, controlled master of the world finally lost his composure. He understood in a flash of fury that he had been outwitted. He had won the world, but had been cheated of his ultimate prize. He dispatched his guards, ordering them to run, to break down the doors, to save me against my will. They arrived too late. They forced the doors of the mausoleum and burst into the chamber, expecting to find a scene of bloody chaos. Instead, they found a tableau of serene, majestic death. They found me lying on my couch, dressed in all my finery, looking not dead, but as if I were merely resting, dreaming of empires. Iris lay at my feet, and Charmian, swaying on the brink of her own death, was carefully, lovingly adjusting my crown, which had tilted slightly. One of the guards, stunned by the scene, asked her, "Was this a right deed, Charmian?" Her final words were for me, for our dynasty, for all that we had been. It is very right and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings. With that last declaration of loyalty, she too collapsed and died. A perfect epitaph for 300 years of Ptolemaic rule. Octavian arrived soon after. He saw the scene with his own cold eyes. He saw my peaceful, composed body, and he knew he had lost. His great triumph in Rome would be a hollow thing. He could parade my treasures, my effigies, even my surviving children. But he could not parade me. My body would never be defiled by the mockery of a Roman mob. I had won the final, most important battle. His physicians were summoned. They examined my body, finding only 2 faint pricks on my arm, but no sign of the serpent which had vanished, adding to the mystery and the legend of my passing. He was furious at being denied his victory, but he was also a man who understood the power of a grand gesture. He honored the final request from my letter. He had me buried with all the royal honors befitting a pharaoh, and he placed me where I had asked, to be in the same magnificent tomb beside my Mark Antony. In death, he gave me the reunion he had denied me in life. We would lie together for all eternity, the last queen and her Roman general, forever entwined in the heart of the kingdom we had loved. And so my story ends. My final address is over. I am speaking to you now from across the great divide, a whisper on the winds of history. I was a queen for 22 years. I held one of the world's great powers, Rome, at bay. I spoke the language of my people. I was a mother, a goddess, and a pharaoh. Remember me not as the Romans wrote of me, as a wicked seductress. Do not remember me as a defeated queen. Remember me as I was. My death was not an act of surrender. It was my final and most triumphant act of command. Do not for a moment believe it was a simple choice of poison, a desperate grab for the quickest exit. Any brute can fall on a sword. Any commoner can swallow a draught of hemlock. I was neither. I was Cleopatra. My death had to be a masterpiece. I considered the alternatives, of course. A dagger, perhaps? Too messy, too violent. It is the Roman way, the way of butchers in a senate house. It leaves a vulgar, gaping wound. My body was not to be marred by such crude instruments. It was a vessel of divinity, and it would remain so. Starvation? I attempted it. It is a slow, wasting, undignified affair. It would have left me gaunt and pitiful, a wretched creature for Octavian to gloat over. My death needed to be an event of beauty and power, not a slow, pathetic fade into nothingness. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me diminished. So I chose my co-conspirator with the utmost care. It was not a substance, but a creature, a symbol, an agent of the gods themselves. To the Romans, it was a snake. To me, it was the sacred asp, the Egyptian cobra, the physical manifestation of the uraeus that adorned the crown of every pharaoh since the dawn of time. The asp, a sacred symbol, not merely an animal, a conduit, a way for a queen to ascend, not to be dragged, a final kiss from Egypt itself. A rather elegant solution, wouldn't you say? Much more dignified than a Roman dungeon. It was a choice steeped in 3,000 years of my country's history. The Romans, in their pragmatic simplicity, would never understand the nuance. They had called me the serpent of the Nile as an insult, a slur meant to paint me as deceitful and venomous. I decided, in my final act, to embrace their insult and transform it into my apotheosis. I would become the serpent, and in doing so, I would become eternal. This was my last act of propaganda, my final message to the world and to the ages. Octavian thought he was writing the final chapter of my story. He intended for it to end with me in chains, a broken woman, the ultimate symbol of his power. I picked up the stylus and wrote a different ending, one he could never erase. The uraeus, the rearing cobra, is the symbol of divine royalty. It sits on the pharaoh's brow, not as mere decoration, but as a protector. It is the embodiment of the goddess Wadjet, who spits fire at the enemies of the king. By choosing the asp, I was making one final symbolic strike against my enemy, Rome. The serpent is the guardian of kings. By inviting it to my breast, I was not committing suicide. I was communing with the divine protector of my office. It was a confirmation of my status. Even in death, I was affirming my right to rule, a right granted by the gods, not by the legions of a Roman upstart. In our mythology, the cobra is also the eye of Ra, the mighty sun god who was the father of all pharaohs. The serpent was his agent on earth, his fiery gaze. To be touched by the sacred asp was to be touched by Ra himself, to be drawn back into the soul of fire from which all life emerges. It was not an end, it was a return to the source. As an incarnation of Isis, the Great Mother, the goddess of magic and wisdom, the serpent held a special resonance. Isis was the mistress of poisons and their antidotes. She was a healer, a protector, a goddess who commanded the forces of nature. My calm command over the instrument of my own death was a final display of my Isaic power. Most importantly, for my people, the bite of the sacred asp was not considered a death at all. It was a sacred transaction. It was believed to deify the victim, to transform a mortal ruler into an immortal god. I was not dying. I was shedding my mortal skin and ascending to my rightful place among the pantheon. This, you see, was how I truly cheated Octavian. He could kill a woman, he could conquer a kingdom, but he could not defeat a goddess. By choosing this death, I removed myself from his mortal grasp. He could parade an effigy of me through Rome, a lifeless statue, but the real me was not there. The real me had escaped. I had performed my own true triumph here in my tomb, a spiritual ascension that made his worldly parade seem a pale and vulgar imitation. So do not mourn my end. It was not an end. It was a transformation. It was the final perfect move in a long and complicated game, a move that ensured that while Octavian might have won the board, I had captured the imagination of the world for all time. The serpent and the crown are one. My story is now legend, a myth whispered for millennia. While empires turn to dust, a well-told story is eternal. If you have journeyed with us this far, you understand that power is not just about armies, but about narrative. To ensure more of history's greatest stories are told, your final act of loyalty to this broadcast is to subscribe. Let the legends live on.
The air in my tomb grows thin, or perhaps it is simply my lungs forgetting their purpose. The poison is a cool, slow river rising within me, a gentle emissary from the gods come to escort me home. The frantic sounds of Octavian's men battering at my doors seem very distant now, like the angry buzzing of inconsequential insects. There is a profound peace in this final sovereign act, a quiet that my life has so rarely afforded me. You have listened to my final broadcast, a story sent across the ages. You have heard of my family, a glorious nest of vipers from which I learned my first lessons in survival. You have heard of my ambition, my love, my wars and my defeats.
This is my testament, my truth, set against the chorus of lies that Rome will now begin to sing. They will call me a harlot, a tyrant, a witch. Let them. You have heard my side of the story. The Romans, and Octavian in particular, never understood power. They thought it resided in the clash of swords, in the tramp of marching legions, in the cold, hard gold piled in a treasury. They were wrong. True power is the absolute and unwavering will to shape your own destiny. I held a kingdom, yes, but my real power was in making the world bend to my vision. My death in this tomb, on my terms, is the ultimate expression of that power. He conquered my kingdom, but he never conquered me. They will write of my loves, of Caesar and Antony, and they will call it my weakness. They will paint me as a seductress who brought great men to their ruin. How small their thinking is! These were not dalliances. They were alliances of the soul, partnerships forged in the crucible of ambition and a shared contempt for the mundane. I saw in these men a reflection of my own fire, and together we burned so brightly we almost set the world alight. I regret nothing. And what of my victor? The boy who now calls himself Caesar Augustus. He has won the world. I hope he enjoys its tedious administration. He will bring them peace, his Pax Romana, a peace of conformity and submission, a world without passion, without grand, beautiful, ruinous dreams, a world of marble and tax ledgers. He has inherited the earth, but he will never know what it is to touch the sun. His legacy will be written in stone and law. He will be remembered as the first emperor of Rome, a great man, a wise ruler. His name will be synonymous with an age of order. And yet, whose story will be told with bated breath around a fire? Whose name will launch 1,000 poems and plays? Whose legend will captivate the hearts of lovers and dreamers for millennia to come? Not his. So this is my farewell to you, my beloved Egypt. I was not born of your soil, but I became your daughter. I learned your language, I worshipped your gods, I wore your sacred crowns. I held the line for you, the last of a long dynasty, against the relentless tide of Rome. Forgive me that I could not hold it forever. My body, like my heart, will now be given back to you. Remember this as you go back to your own lives, your own struggles. History is not a set of facts. It is a story, and it is always, always written by the victors. This has been my desperate final attempt to seize the stylus, to write my own epitaph before they could carve theirs for me. This broadcast has been my last battle, my voice, my final weapon against the silence they would impose. The venom is a cool river now, carrying me home. The broadcast is almost over. My voice grows faint. Listen closely now, my friends, for these are the last words of Egypt.